Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you two main ways that I like to blend with acrylics. Now the first is going to be just using the paintbrush and it's just going to be slightly damp, and then the second is using a fine mist sprayer bottle for those who struggle with how quick acrylics dry. That's one of the biggest complaints that they can get, but sometimes for me when I'm using acrylics I'll actually use a hairdryer to speed up that drying process. But if that is something that is something that's quite challenging, then the second technique can work really well for that. Now obviously how quick your acrylics dry is going to vary a lot on the environment, how warm it is, whether or not there's more humidity in your studio and so on. But these two techniques that I'm going to show you here are my personal favourites on how I like to blend, especially for things like backgrounds. So I'm going to do a purple gradient for the first one. So I'm going to just mix some of the titanium white, a lovely opaque colour, and I'm going to start to add a very small amount of the dioxazine purple to it. Now when you are working with the paint, it's really important to not have too much on your brush, but also not to have it quite dry with paint. There's sort of a bit of a fine balance between the two. But the more that you paint, you'll start to get a feel for how much paint you need on that brush for this kind of blending. So I'm going to just work to start with mixing a light purple. And I'm using a 1-inch flat brush here. And I'm just going to start to paint on, keeping my brush strokes nice and straight. Working with the lighter colour to start with. Picking up more of that paint. Now you'll notice as well that the brush strokes are going across completely onto the bit of MDF board that I am working on, and that's so that I don't end up with a halo on the edge of my canvas. So what I've done is just added smaller amounts of the dioxazine purple to it. But you'll notice that I'm going up 1 or 2 inches and then bringing the brush back down so that I can try and create that nice gradient effect. Just move my light there. That's going to really help to also brush out and smooth out those brush strokes. And then further down on the canvas I go, I'm just going to add a little bit more of my dioxazine purple. Now this for me is probably one of my favourite blending techniques when I am working with backgrounds, especially when you want to create a nice gradient effect like this, because the acrylic paint will stay wet long enough for you to create this kind of effect. So I'm adding even more of the dioxazine purple here. There isn't a huge amount of paint here as well. You can see the canvas is still showing through here. So I'm not completely smothering paint over the surface. It's just enough that enables me to blend these colours together. So I've added even more of the purple here, going all the way over the edge of that board, really important. And then smoothing that out. Now you can see all of this is in real time, but you can see how quickly I'm moving my hand back and forth. The slower that you move your hand, you're going to start to get more brush strokes and you won't have this nice gradient effect that you can see here. Now I don't have any brush strokes as such, but if you did and you wanted to smooth those out, you can use a soft makeup blush brush here, and you can use that to just soften out any of the brush strokes that you might see. If you did that, I would do it in the same motion, so you'd go back and forth, work up into the lighter area, and then you can do the same, and that really smooths out all of this lovely gradient. You can see here it's from dark to light and it is effortless, and it's been very quick in order to replicate this kind of blending. For me, I'd say that that is perfect. I wouldn't have to adjust that any further. Now the one thing that I did mention at the beginning here is that I was using opaque colours. If you use a translucent colour, and the Liquitex Basics, which is what I'm using at the moment, does have some of the transparent colours to it, that won't have the same effect as what I'm using for this here. I am using more of the opaque colours. If you needed to use some of the transparent colours, I would be working with a glaze thin down those colours and do exactly the same process, but apply a glaze on top to tint that colour. That can also work really well. But certainly for your base layer, just like what I've worked on here, the more opaque that colour is, so the harder it is to see through that colour, you're going to be able to create much more of this nicer, softer gradient effect. Now here I haven't used any of the water, I've just used the paint straight out of the tube here in order to create this effect. If, however, you're finding that at various stages your paintbrush is feeling like it's gripping the canvas too much, that's an indication that your paint is starting to dry. All I would do is dip the very tip of the brush in the water. You can see here how it's got a little bit lighter. I've only dipped a few millimeters in that water, and then start back with your brushwork. That will just help to reactivate that layer underneath slightly because it isn't completely dry. By adding this extra bit of water on top, you're going to, as I say, reactivate that, and you're going to be able to carry on adding this blended technique. Another tip as well, if you have too much paint and you're applying far too much of that to the canvas, so let's say you had this much paint on the end of the brush, you can see there's quite a good blob on the end there. What you'll end up creating is more brush strokes. Because the paint is thicker on the canvas, it will dry much slower because the paint layer is thicker. However, you won't get this softer effect like what I've created here, and that's because the paint is too thick. You don't want all of those brush strokes to show through. We want this to be nice and smooth. So really limit how much paint you've got on the end of that brush. You'll also see that I haven't gone all the way to the end here where the metal joins up to the bristles. I don't want to clog the paint all the way up to the end, that will damage your brush. So it's a fine balance between how much paint to mix on that brush at one time and work from, ideally I like to work from light to dark. The other way would work as well, obviously you just do it in reverse. Okay, so the second method, and this is using a fine mist spray bottle. Mine just looks like this. And what it does is the more that you press the trigger, you're going to be able to get the continuous flow of the water, but it is a fine mist. If you've got another water bottle that's not quite like this, what will happen is larger water droplets will end up on your surface. It can then start to make the paint run, which is not what we want. So the fine mist sprayer, as it sounds like it does, it will create that much more of a finer layer of water, which is perfect for blending acrylics. So this would be the way that I would recommend if you're struggling with how quickly the acrylics dry. So what I'm going to do to start with is I've just got a damp brush just where I've cleaned it off. It's the same one that I used for this side. And I'm going to go with just a nice turquoise teal colour to start with. And I'm just going to apply a complete layer of this one colour over the top. Now for this technique, I will be adding slightly more water with the mixture, but it is only a very small amount. Now the reason for this is I want to try and get this, as you can see, it's coming on a little bit thinner. I just want to try and get the coverage of this layer down a little bit quicker than I had to when working with that technique. So I'm adding, as I say, a little bit of water here. Not too much, it's still not running down the canvas. This will help to keep the paint a little bit wetter for longer. Still making sure that I'm going all the way to the edge of the canvas. Also, when working with this technique, if you do keep intermittently running this brush up towards the top bit that you did first, that's just going to help to keep that layer wetter. So I'm just going to do the same here. Being very quick again with the technique. What you can then do is apply a light layer with the water. You want to hold this about a foot or so away from your canvas. You don't want to have too much of that water on that surface. If you do end up with water droplets running down your surface, that means you've put far too much water on that canvas. Wait for it to dry and then you'll be able to just follow the same process which I'm going to show you here. So all I've done is added some red to the mixture. And I'm now just going to start to mix in that bit of water that I added. I'm going to go with even more red here. But because this surface is now nice and wet, because I have used that fine mist sprayer bottle, I'm starting here at the bottom of the canvas. Oh, got some of the paint there on that side. So I'm starting at the bottom, and then bringing that brush up gradually. I'm going to add even more red. But at this point, when I'm adding colour here, I'm not adding any more water to my brush. This is just that layer of the water with that fine mist sprayer. So I'm going to add even more red. And this really does help, as you can see, to keep this surface and this paint wetter for longer. Really, by using this fine mist sprayer bottle, you don't actually have to have your paints dry out at all. You could carry on using them, very similar to how artists that use oils work. So I'm just going back and forth, not reloading my brush at any point here. Just slowly bringing that colour down to the bottom and then back up towards the top. And that can create a really nice soft transition as well. Now what you can do here, you can also then add colour back in over the top. So for instance now, if you feel like this is too much of the darker colour that's creeped up towards that top edge, wash off that brush, wipe it off on a bit of paper towel, get more of that first turquoise colour that you started with, and then just go back over the top, no water added here, add more of that turquoise, wipe off that brush because we don't want too much paint as we start to mix towards the darker colour. We just want to gradually fade that in. So you want to wipe off that brush to make sure that we're not then transferring too much of this teal colour. And you really can just keep reworking the layer as long as it hasn't dried out. Now again, if you do feel that it's getting a bit tacky, just do another light layer with the fine mist sprayer bottle. And again, just maybe you wanted that light, the top section a little lighter. So if we add some titanium white to our turquoise colour, just to get a little bit more variation. So this layer is still completely wet. It hasn't at the moment started drying at all. I'm going to add more white. Because of the amount of layers that we're putting on here, this will take obviously that much longer to dry once you have finished with the blending. And with these layers where you are just starting to add more of this lighter layer, as I say, if you are trying to adjust this gradient, there doesn't have to be as much paint on your brush. A little bit of something there. So as long as we keep these layers wet, there really is no limit to how much we can blend with acrylics. And it is one of the most common complaints that the medium gets, is that they dry too fast. But I personally like that about them. I switched over from oils to acrylics because I didn't like how long the oils took to dry. So what I can do, now that I've got more paint here on this side, you can start to see more of those brush strokes that I mentioned. So what I'm going to do is just get the same brush that I used for this side. I'm just going to make sure it's got none of that purple on it. And then I'm going to soften out these brush strokes, going back and forth exactly in the same way that I did when I was applying the paint. Wiping off that brush again. Now one thing that is quite important, if I was wanting to make sure that I didn't get any of this purple onto the top section, I would switch over to another blending brush. It wouldn't matter what one it was, as long as it was very soft, and that would then be for my lighter layers, and then you could start working down towards the darker colour. You wouldn't want to cross-contaminate the two, especially because this paint is still very wet. So that's going to be how I smooth out all of my brush strokes. You can go even more, so if you want more texture in your initial layers, you can obviously stop blending at that point that you're happy with. But as long as you are wiping off the brush in between so that you're not shifting too much of that paint about, you can completely soften all of these brush strokes out. So what I'll quickly do now is I'll show you the technique that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, where I mentioned about you can then adjust that colour with a glaze. So let's say I wanted this purple a little bit more on the magenta side. So if I get more of my magenta colour and I really water that down, something similar to the consistency of milk, that's how I like to work with my glazes. I don't use any glazing medium in my artwork at all. So I've thinned that down, and I'm going to use the same brush strokes back and forth, left to right, but I'm not going to reload my brush. So I'm still, as I say, working in quite straight lines here, but I'm easing off on the pressure as I get up towards the middle. I can then get my blending brush, something similar as long as it's clean. You can add even more water to help thin out that layer even more. So I'm adding more of the water to the mixture as I get midway up to the portrait here. That's just going to help with that translucency. And then what I'm going to do is clean off my brush completely. That glaze will stay wet for a couple of minutes. So I'm going to clean off my brush and just go over the top just with the water and really dilute that top part of the glaze out so that it really does fade off into that lighter section. That can then really completely change the colour without actually having to repaint the entire background. Again, if you want it darker, you can just keep relayering. And at the bottom here is less water, so we want to go a bit more of a thicker glaze. We can take that a little bit more, add in a bit more red to the mixture if you wanted more of the opaque colour. The magenta is quite a transparent colour. So it really depends on how obvious you need to make that colour adjustment as to whether or not you need to pick more of your transparent colours or more of your opaque colours. It's going to vary as well on the brand of paint that you use. I do like Liquitex Basics because I like to work in glazes, just as you've seen how easy it's been for me to adjust the colour. Don't want any harsh lines, so make sure you soften all that out with that left and right movement. So that's how you can use glazes to then create that nice soft blended transition. But as you saw, it's very much in making sure that you then go back with a clean brush, just with a little bit of water on. It's not anything too saturated with water. You want to still make sure that you do wipe it off, and then using that clean brush to make sure you can then drag that very, very thin layer back up into your background to start with. So something that I'll quickly show you, because it's something that I do a lot, I sometimes make the gradient here not as bright as what I initially intended. So this side here, I'd be very happy with it. But for this section here, I would potentially want this bit to be more brighter, contain more of that white. So I'll just quickly show you how you can adjust that very easily. Now first off, just like when you're adding the glaze that I just showed you to adjust the colour and also still get that soft blend in, you want to make sure that your base layer and whatever you've done so far before this next stage is completely dry, because what will happen is you'll just start mixing in the colour from the previous layers and not get the desired outcome that you're after. So what I'm going to do is just use some of the transparent mix in white by Liquitex Basics. I'm going to also then thin that down with some water as well, again just like a glaze, so that it's even thinner. So I'm already using a transparent colour, and then making it more transparent by thinning it down. So I'm going to not work all the way to the top, going to come part of the way down, adding some of this colour as you can see here, but because it is transparent I'm still able to really still get that gradient effect in the background come through. So I've added more water just to help to keep this wetter. Again, I've done exactly the same, and now what I'm going to do is wash off that brush completely and do exactly the same as what I did on this side. Get a damp brush, just got water on, and I'm going to thin that out. Make sure to bring that brush stroke right down to the mid 2/3 of the way down. And then I'm now going to start adding more of my titanium white. So this is the much more opaque colour. Adding a little bit of water to this mixture. Now if you don't want this as bright, you can still add some of the turquoise colour that you used to start with. Now the paint on the board here is still a little bit wet, so it's actually picking up some of the paint. The surface was completely dry, but I didn't make sure that the sides were. So it's not going to be as white, but that's okay because I didn't want it pure white. But it's just something to bear in mind. If you do want to make sure that you don't have any cross contamination, do make sure that the sides are dry as well with your hairdryer. So I'm not reloading the brush at the moment. As you can see, I'm putting a little bit more pressure on the brush to get a little bit more of this paint out. And then I'm going to repeat the same process. I'm going to wash off this brush completely, dab it on a paper towel so that it's not completely wet. And then just with the water, go back and then soften out that even more. And that's how I would then reactivate that background. Very easy to do, it's very forgiving. One of the most common criticisms is that the acrylics are hard to work with. But if you, as you saw here, just work in those light layers to start with, add in a little bit more of that water if you need to, it now looks like that I created this gradient right from the very beginning and just did wet on wet blending. However, the transparent mixing white does make such a difference when you are wanting to try and mix the lighter colour into the darker colour. So I really hope this tutorial was of use. If you'd like me to make more videos on this kind of tutorials, pastels or acrylics, do let me know in the comments below because I'm more than happy to make any kind of tailored content as I can. And if this video was of use, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content I upload, hit the subscribe button in the corner and the bell button, and then you will get notified, hopefully, of the videos that I upload here to YouTube. Now I do also have in-depth tutorials available on Patreon, so I'll link that in the description below, and I also have a Patreon library where you can see all of the tutorials that I've got available as soon as you sign up. So as I say, I really hope this tutorial was of use, and I really do hope you have a good new year and that the Christmas that you had and the nice few days off were lovely as well. So I'll be uploading another video here to YouTube in 2022.